Imagine a young boy. He's 15 years old. And he's experienced the horrors of war. In this case, he grew up in Hungary, in Budapest, a beautiful city in Central Europe. They called it the Paris of the East. And he was 9 when World War II erupted. By the end of the war, his home city was devastated. 3 out of 5 buildings had been bombed. 3 out of 5. As the Nazis were surrounded at the end of the war, they blew up every single bridge over the Danube. It was devastating. But this young boy finally one day had hope. He had a sense of a brighter future after years of death and destruction. Why? Because he heard the great men, the Prime Minister of England, the President of America, and the Soviet Premier had sat down in a faraway city called Yalta, and they'd come to a peace agreement. And in that peace agreement, the devastated countries that had been occupied by the Nazis were guaranteed their freedom. Guaranteed their freedom. They would be allowed to have elections. They would be allowed to choose their own governments again, to be independent. So he had hope. But then what happened? If you know your history, in the next 3 years, wherever the Soviet troops had ended up after the war, which was all through Central Europe, Czechoslovakia, Poland, East Germany, Hungary, you name it, Russia took control. This isn't theory. This isn't somebody spouting off socialist theory at a rally. It was real life. If you stood against the socialists, you'd be intimidated. If you kept standing up against them, you'd be beaten up. And if you didn't give up, you'd be killed. So by 1948, when he started college, his country was again occupied, taken over, not run by Nazis, but run by communists. One party, controlling everything, reporting back to Moscow. It had become a satellite, a slave nation, like all the others in the region. So what did this young man do? He said, I'm going to resist. As he started college, he says, I'm going to fight back. But not with a gun, not with a bomb, but with information. So he found 8 like-minded patriots, Christians, in college. And he created a secret student organization, an underground organization that was going to spy on what the Russians were doing, how they were stealing his country for Moscow, and then send that information out to the West, to some free country that could potentially use that information against the dictatorship in Moscow. And they were very successful. They found a man who had freedom of passage across the Iron Curtain, who smuggled their information, and this isn't a joke, written in invisible ink, in innocuous letters between the innocuous lines. They'd write in the sensitive information. He'd smuggle it out to Vienna, and then he established contact with a Western intelligence agency. In this case, it was MI6, the British equivalent of the CIA. And they said, here's the information, use it to undermine Moscow and to try and get Hungary to be free again. The bad news was, once that information arrived at MI6 headquarters, it worked its way up the chain to a certain man. That man was colloquially known as Kim Philby. Look him up one day after your conference. Because Kim Philby is one of the 5 greatest traitors of the Judeo-Christian civilization in recent history. He was a member of something called the Cambridge Apostles, a group of British students who had been recruited by the forerunner of the KGB in college, and they worked their way into British government. into the intelligence services to work for Moscow, to help our sworn enemies. So he was very happy to get these reports, because then he could help identify who these patriots are. And he allowed the cell to run for another 8 months until he could identify the name of every single patriot, every single student. And then he sent a secret message to his handler, who sent it back to Moscow, to the KGB, with the names of all the students. Two years later, the young man was now 20. At 2 a.m., there was a violent banging on the door of his parents' home. In burst the communist secret police and arrested him. They took him away to the headquarters of the secret police, a beautiful mansion in downtown Budapest, where in the basement they relentlessly tortured him for being a patriot, physical torture. He ended up being put through a show trial, a communist show trial, and at the age of 20 being given a life sentence in prison for what he believed, because he was a patriot. He spent 2 years in solitary. Now think about that for a second. Not 2 weeks, not 2 months, 2 years without human contact. Then 2 years down a prison coal mine, where he was breaking coal off the surface of the mine as a political prisoner. And then another 2 years in the central political prison, until the glorious events of 1956 and October, which are known as the Hungarian Revolution, where a bunch of students again and factory workers said, enough, we've had enough of communism. And after 8 years of dictatorship, they stood up to their slave masters and they fought for freedom with Molotov cocktails, with hunting shotguns, with cobblestones. And for 10 glorious days, that slave nation was free. One of the things the freedom fighters did is they captured a Soviet tank. And they thought, what can we do with a Soviet tank? We can't take on hundreds of tanks, we'll just be blown away. Let's use it to liberate our comrades who are locked in political prison. So they took the tank, they drove it to the political prison, they bust down the gates, and they went through the whole prison, liberating those who had been imprisoned for their beliefs. And that young man was free. A few days later, the revolution was crushed. Hundreds of tanks came in from Romania and Ukraine, thousands of troops, Russians came in to crush that young revolution. And that man was very, very aware of what would happen if he were caught. They wouldn't put him back in prison. He was an escaped political prisoner. He'd be shot on sight and kicked into the gutter. So he had no choice. I have to leave the land that I love. But he remembered a promise he'd made 3 years before in prison to a slightly older prisoner who said to him, "Hey Paul, if you ever get out of here, will you promise me something? Will you take my teenage daughter to freedom? Get her out of here." And Paul, who thought he was going to die in prison, said, "Sure, George, whatever." But then he was free, and he remembered his promise to George. So just before he left the country, he looked up, there used to be a thing called telephone books, long before you were born. Looked up George's address, his old address in the phone book, walked across Budapest to his house, knocked on the door and said, "Hey, it's me, I'm Paul. I'm leaving now. I've got to get out of here. I'm on a shoot to kill list. Where's your daughter?" He met a 17-year-old girl called Susan underneath a train, clinging on for life. They made it to the western border with Austria. They gave their last dime to a local farmer who showed them the route through the minefield. They tripped the flare. The border guards almost got them, but they made it to freedom and to a refugee camp. Now, what has that got to do with you? The story 70 years ago. Long way away in Europe. Because I want to share with you why I do what I do. Why I decided to work for President Trump. Why I called out that lying, abusive punk Brian Karen in the Rose Garden.